Okay, hi there, it's Jeff back again with another video on a key diagram. The tariff diagram is one that most students will need to revise ahead of their papers, so let's walk through the basic import tariff diagram. So we're going to think about the tariff applied to steel, where the world supply price is lower than would normally be charged in the domestic market without trade. Just quickly before we look at that, here are some examples of tariffs applied globally. These are the trade-weighted average tariffs, and the source is the World Bank, up to and including the year before the pandemic. You see here there's been a rise actually in the average tariff applied on consumer goods, things like washing machines and LCD TV screens and so on and so forth. Tariffs for other products, including intermediate goods, raw materials and capital goods, are lower. And those are kind of used in production, but there's been an increase in the average tariff globally on consumer goods. Farm goods, also quite interesting. This is the most favoured nation applied import tariff percentages for a selection of countries. I've been into the World Trade Organization database, and you can see that countries like Australia and New Zealand have fairly low import tariffs for farm goods, whereas in countries like South Korea, 57%, Vietnam 17%, India 34%. So some pretty high tariffs there. The average European Union tariff for farm goods was 11% in 2019, when of course the UK was a member, but the UK has now left the European Union. Okay, let's walk through together, if it's okay with you, the import tariff diagram. The price P1 is the equilibrium price with no trade, but we then assumed, if you go back to my previous video, that steel could be bought and sold at the world price of P2, which is substantially below the domestic equilibrium price. And if a country allows free trade in steel at the price P2, then demand expands to Q2, but domestic supply contracts to Q3. And at price P2, the majority of the market is supplied by imports. You see at price P2, domestic producers are only able to produce quantity Q3 because their costs are higher. Okay, so obviously if you're drawing an import tariff diagram, an import is a tax on supply of imports. So that increases the price paid when the products are imported. And clearly the effect depends on the magnitude of the tariff. I'm going to assume that the tariff increases the price to price P3. As a result, domestic consumers must now pay more for their steel. Think about construction industry, for example, and car makers. So demand will contract from Q2 to Q4. Domestic supply, however, they get a boost from the tariff. They're now better able to supply at the price P3, so their production will expand from Q3 to Q5. Just going to put some labels on there. Remember, in the exam, it's best to label rather than shade. It's much clearer, much more focused way of doing it. So domestic supply expands from point E to point F. Domestic demand contracts from point D to point G. There's your basic tariff diagram. And you can see there's been an expenditure switching here. The volume of imports will fall from Q3, Q2 to Q5, Q4 as a result of the tariff. Might be worth taking a screenshot of your basic tariff diagram. Now, for higher level analysis and evaluation, you'll definitely need to develop the diagram to show some of the welfare effects of an import tariff, and we'll do that in the next video. And also to consider the importance of elasticity of demand, of supply and demand, when looking at the impact domestically of bringing in an import tariff. The impact also depends on the magnitude, the size of the tariff, and also the duration. Is it a temporary tariff or one that assumes an air of permanence? And those of you who want to get the absolute top marks here might also want to introduce some game theory into your analysis and evaluation. So to what extent is a persistent trade war involving tariffs a suboptimal outcome from those countries involved? So there we go, the basic import tariff diagram.